She flew economy, silently enduring ridicule and humiliation. No one knew who she was, until the captain came up and slapped her in the face. What happened next shook the entire plane. Watch to the end, and write in the comments what country you're from. Don't forget to subscribe. The terminal was crowded with the usual rhythm of life in transit. Suitcases rolling over tile, muffled boarding calls over the intercom, families arguing softly over seating arrangements, businessmen tapping at laptops with an air of urgency that seemed manufactured. Among them moved a tall woman in a gray hoodie and plain black track pants, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She wore no makeup, her blonde hair pulled tightly into a practical ponytail, and a pair of dark sunglasses masked most of her face. There was nothing about her that drew attention, which was precisely the point. Ronda Rousey had once been known around the globe. Olympic medalist, undefeated UFC champion, WrestleMania headliner, she had been the face on 1,000 posters, the headline of 1,000,000 articles. But she wasn't here to be recognized, and she certainly wasn't here for fanfare. She'd chosen a commercial flight from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. Economy class, no entourage, no upgrades, just herself. That was how she wanted it. It wasn't about making a statement or testing herself. It was about disappearing for a moment, to blend, to move unseen, to remember what it felt like to be just another person in the world. After months of cameras, contracts, and press junkets, she needed air, even if it was recycled cabin air 30,000 feet above the desert. At the check-in counter, the clerk glanced at her, then at her ID. There was a pause, the kind that lingered half a second too long, just enough to signal suspicion. The young man looked from her face to the laminated photo, then back again. His lips curled slightly. "You're Ronda?" he said, not finishing the thought. She gave a quiet nod. The man didn't press. He printed the boarding pass without comment and handed it to her with a flick of the wrist, already turning to the next customer. She didn't mind. It was better than being mobbed. At the gate, she waited quietly in a corner, hood up, head down. A few people looked her way, some curious, some confused, but no one approached. When pre-boarding was called for those needing extra assistance or traveling with young children, she remained still. Only when Group C was announced did she rise and take her place in line. She boarded near the end, shuffling forward among passengers dragging carry-ons, murmuring complaints about seat assignments and overhead bin space. When she reached the front of the plane, the flight attendant by the entrance didn't greet her. She greeted the woman ahead with a bright, fake smile. "Welcome aboard." But when it was Rhonda's turn, her eyes moved quickly over her form, then away, expression unreadable. Ronda continued down the narrow aisle without comment. Her seat was 27B, a middle seat sandwiched between a thin, elderly woman with tightly curled gray hair and a boy of about 12 wearing headphones. Neither looked at her as she sat. She stowed her bag beneath the seat and buckled in. Around her, the cabin buzzed. People settled in, snapped seatbelts, unwrapped snacks. The boy beside her chewed gum loudly and played some tinny beat through his earbuds. The woman to her left looked out the window, unmoving, as though already trying to forget she was on an airplane. Someone a few rows back snorted loudly and said, "Damn, that guy's got arms like a gorilla." There was laughter. Ronda kept her eyes down. She wasn't even sure they were talking about her, but she felt the old familiar rise in her chest, the one that preceded weigh-ins and press conferences, the one that meant her dignity was being offered up as the punchline to someone else's joke. She breathed, slowly. When the flight attendant passed by with the manifest, She paused at Rhonda's row. The woman, blonde, polished, her name tag, reading C. Palmer, gave Ronda a glance and then looked to the elderly woman beside her. "Would you prefer an aisle seat, ma'am?" she asked kindly. The older woman shook her head. "No, I'm fine." Palmer nodded and turned to leave. Not a word to Ronda. It was a small thing, but it wasn't. The plane took off 20 minutes later, climbing into the sky over the Nevada desert. Ronda kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the clouds through the window to her left over the old woman's shoulder. The boy, to her right, was now watching a superhero movie on his tablet. Everything around her was noise. Chatter, coughing, the rustle of wrappers. She reached up and pressed the call button. It took several minutes, but eventually Palmer returned, her expression tight. "Yes," she said, a little too sharp. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Ronda asked, her voice even. "We haven't started service yet." "I know. Sorry, my throat's just dry." Palmer's mouth formed a line. She turned and walked away without another word. Behind her, Ronda heard a man laugh softly. "Can't people just wait like the rest of us?" She didn't respond. She turned her head back to the window. When Palmer returned, she dropped the plastic cup onto Ronda's tray hard enough that it splashed. A small puddle formed immediately. The flight attendant said nothing and moved on. Ronda wiped the water with a napkin, hands steady. She didn't make eye contact, didn't speak. Another hour passed. Turbulence rattled the plane lightly. People began to shift in their seats, some trying to nap. Ronda remained still, her back straight, legs tucked, ignoring the stares from the row across the aisle. Palmer passed again, this time checking on the elderly woman. "Doing all right?" she asked sweetly. "Yes, thank you." Then, as she turned to walk on, the plane dipped slightly and Palmer stumbled. She caught herself on the headrest in front of Ronda, then glanced down with a scowl. "People like you always want special treatment," she muttered under her breath. Ronda blinked. Her head turned slowly. "Excuse me?" Palmer's lips curled in disdain. "Don't play dumb. I've dealt with your type before." Across the aisle, a woman snorted. "My type? You know exactly what I mean." The tension in the cabin thickened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the boy beside her paused his movie. Ronda turned back to the window. She didn't reply, but the boy looked at her differently now. When meal service began, Ronda was passed over. She waited. When she pressed the call button again, Palmer returned with visible irritation. "I didn't get a meal," Ronda said simply. "We're out," Palmer replied curtly. "I pre-ordered." "Maybe you clicked the wrong box," Palmer said, her tone dripping with condescension. The words sat in the air like smoke. The woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband and whispered, "I swear, she looks like she could break someone in half, probably juiced up on steroids." Ronda didn't move, but something inside her shifted. Not anger, not hurt, something else, something colder. When the boy next to her took off his headphones, he whispered, "Are you Ronda Rousey?" She glanced at him, said nothing. He grinned, but Palmer, returning again, caught the moment. "Is that who you're pretending to be now?" she said with a scoff. "You wish." Then she laughed, a short, mean sound. Ronda closed her eyes. She'd come here to disappear, to be invisible. But the world, it seemed, wouldn't let her, and the worst of it hadn't even started yet. It would begin, truly begin, when the captain opened the door to the cabin. When the man in the dark uniform stepped into the aisle with authority in his stride and venom in his voice. When judgment, assumption, and aggression collided with discipline, restraint, and the calm center forged from years of battle. But that would come later. For now, Ronda remained seated in 27B, surrounded by whispers, the sting of disrespect fresh on her skin, and the weight of something much larger growing just beneath the surface. The air in the cabin had changed, subtly but noticeably. What had begun as scattered remarks and isolated glares now felt like a collective mood, a low hum of judgment pulsing through the rows like recycled air. Ronda remained in her seat, her hands resting calmly on her thighs, her gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. The boy beside her had gone quiet, sensing the tension, and the elderly woman to her left had started shifting uncomfortably in her seat, trying not to look at anyone. A pair of college-age women in the row across from her leaned into each other and whispered with cupped hands. One of them snapped a photo under the guise of stretching her arm across the aisle, the phone angled perfectly toward Ronda. She heard the artificial click of a shutter sound, faint but unmistakable. Moments later, there was a stifled giggle. It was the kind of cruelty she recognized immediately. Low effort, cowardly, and always hungry for a response. She gave none. The whispers returned, louder this time. The women were showing the photo to someone else now, and Ronda caught a glimpse of the screen as the phone passed by. A picture of her mid-blink, mouth slightly open, posture unflattering. Someone had already written a caption. She could bench press this plain LOL. From a few rows ahead, a deep voice chimed in, meant to be heard. These athletes these days can't even tell the women from the men. Must be the hormones. A ripple of agreement passed through a few passengers. Laughter here, a cough masking amusement there. People weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. It was as if a silent permission had been granted. To ridicule, to belittle, to dehumanize, because Ronda didn't look the part they wanted her to play. She wasn't delicate, wasn't deferential, wasn't packaged in a way that asked for their approval. And worse, she wasn't reacting. The lack of response only seemed to fuel them. Like children poking at a sleeping lion, they kept pushing, desperate to provoke a reaction they could label as aggression. Anything to justify their discomfort with a woman who didn't apologize for existing in her skin. A voice from behind her, louder than the others, said she probably thought she'd get recognized. That's why she's acting like she's better than everyone else. Ronda blinked slowly. She had expected whispers. She had not expected this wave of open hostility, this coordinated spectacle of small cruelties, but she understood it. It was the same dynamic she'd seen 100 times in locker rooms, press conferences, and social media comment threads. The same ugly energy dressed in new clothes. Palmer returned to the aisle, pushing the beverage cart like a conqueror in her territory. She didn't look at Ronda as she passed her the second time, and when Ronda politely tried to request a meal again, she had indeed pre-ordered one. The flight attendant paused just long enough to deliver her response with saccharine precision. "We don't have any left," Palmer said, her voice tinged with mock sympathy. "Maybe you clicked the wrong button, sweetie." The word sweetie hit like a slap. The older woman beside Ronda looked over then, lips parting as if to say something, but she quickly turned away, unwilling to invite trouble. The boy beside her kept his eyes fixed on his screen, though his posture had stiffened. He was pretending not to hear, pretending not to be aware. Ronda didn't blame him. She sat back in her seat. The cup of water on her tray remained untouched. 10 minutes later, Palmer reappeared, now collecting trash. When she reached Ronda's row, she motioned to the tray. "Are you finished, sir?" she said too quickly. There was a beat of silence. Ronda looked up, her expression unreadable. Palmer realized the slip too late. "Ma'am," she corrected, but the damage was done. The man across the aisle burst into laughter. "You sure about that?" More laughter followed. A chorus of low chuckles, nudges, and exaggerated looks of mock confusion. Ronda breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the thin, metallic air of the cabin. "I don't care how strong she is," another passenger whispered behind her. "You can't just let someone like that intimidate the whole flight." "Someone like that" rang in her ears. She sat still, unmoving, letting it all wash over her like cold water. Then came the moment that set the rest in motion. The flight attendant in the rear galley, a different one, younger, softer-eyed, walked down the aisle and leaned over to Palmer at the beverage cart. They exchanged hushed words. The younger woman glanced toward Ronda's seat and then back again. Palmer nodded, lips tight. Within minutes, Palmer made a show of walking to the intercom and picking up the receiver. Her voice rang out over the speakers, calm and rehearsed. "Captain, we have a concern in the main cabin. A passenger in row 27 is exhibiting unsettling behavior and has made several other guests uncomfortable. I recommend a safety check when convenient." The message wasn't coded. Everyone heard it. The boy beside her visibly shrank into his seat. The elderly woman beside Ronda looked away as if distance could dissolve guilt. Ronda turned her head slightly and stared at the intercom. So that was how it would go. Not because of anything she'd done. Not because she'd raised her voice or threatened anyone, but because she made people uncomfortable simply by sitting in silence, by existing outside their narrow expectations. 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. The captain emerged with the confidence of someone who believed in his authority as absolute. He was in his late 50s, square-jawed, with thinning gray hair and a neatly pressed uniform. His steps were firm, purposeful. He scanned the cabin as he approached, nodding politely to passengers as they smiled and gave him subtle gestures of support. He stopped at row 27 and looked directly at Ronda. His expression said everything. Disdain, superiority, the tired contempt of a man who had long since stopped hiding his biases. "Everything all right here?" he asked. Ronda didn't speak. Palmer stepped in beside him. "She's been making several people uncomfortable, Captain. Her behavior's erratic. She asked for water before service started. She's refused to eat. She keeps staring at passengers." The captain narrowed his eyes. "Name?" Ronda replied evenly. "Ronda Rousey." He blinked, then he laughed, not politely. Not the laugh of someone who found the coincidence amusing. The laugh of someone who didn't believe her. "Right," he said, drawing the word out. "And I'm Tom Brady." A few passengers chuckled. Palmer smirked. "She's trying to pretend to be someone she's not," Palmer added. "And honestly, she's starting to disturb the people around her. Some even thought she was a man at first. It's making people nervous." The captain turned his gaze back to Ronda. "Is that true? Are you impersonating someone?" "No," she replied. He took a step closer. "Let's see your boarding pass." She handed it to him without hesitation. He glanced at it, then held it up as if expecting it to reveal something nefarious. It didn't. Palmer chimed in again. "I think it would be best if she were moved to the back of the plane." Ronda's expression didn't change. The captain stared at her another long moment. Then he tilted his head, almost casually. "You know," he said, loud enough for those around to hear, "you'd make a great fighter. Too bad you look like one, too." And with that, he smirked and slapped her across the face. There was a collective gasp. The moment froze. No one laughed now. Ronda sat still for half a second, her cheek stinging, her mind processing the weight of what had just occurred. The silence around her was thick with disbelief. Phones came out, cameras flicked on. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." She turned slowly to face him, and everything in her changed. The next moment would be burned into the memory of everyone on that flight. The moment when stillness turned to action and the target of mockery became the master of the room. But that moment belonged to what came next. The silence had spoken. Now it was time for the storm. Time collapsed into silence. The slap had not been loud, but its echo reverberated through every row of the cabin like the crack of thunder across a clear sky. For the briefest of moments, no one breathed. No tray shifted, no bag rustled, no whisper filled the space. The weight of disbelief pressed down on every passenger, an invisible hand tightening around the spine of the plane. Eyes darted from the captain to the woman in seat 27B, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Ronda sat completely still. Her cheek tingled where his hand had made contact, a sharp, stinging heat blooming against her skin. But there was no tremble in her fingers, no shift in her posture. She simply turned her head, her neck moving with the precision of a machine engineered for control, and locked eyes with the man who had struck her. She did not raise her voice. She did not snarl. Her stare alone made the captain take an involuntary half-step back. Palmer gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The smirk that had hovered so comfortably across her face for the better part of the flight had dissolved, replaced by a look of immediate panic. She looked around at the watching passengers, noting the phones now trained on the scene, the red dots glowing as videos recorded. She reached for the captain's arm, but it was too late. Ronda stood. She didn't leap up or lunge. She rose with slow, deliberate grace, the way one might stand before a match. No wasted movement, no unnecessary drama. The top of her head nearly met the captain's brow, and in that instant, the difference in presence became undeniable. He had authority stitched into his uniform. She had it engraved into her bones. Her eyes never left his. He opened his mouth, whether to scold, to threaten, or to excuse himself. No one would ever know, because the next thing he felt was her hand around his wrist, firm and unyielding. With one fluid motion, Ronda pivoted her hips, redirected his balance, and brought him down, not violently but effectively. The captain stumbled, his knees buckling as she guided him with a clean technique into the aisle floor. He landed with a thud and a grunt, his expression caught somewhere between fury and humiliation. Before he could rise again, she had him restrained in a modified wrist lock, his arm bent in a way that signaled unmistakably, "Do not move." A wave of gasps passed through the cabin, but there was no screaming, no panic, just awe. Palmer cried out, lunging forward, but stopped short, unsure of what to do. Another flight attendant further back yelled for someone to call the authorities. Passengers in the front rows turned, stunned and uncertain whether to intervene or stay seated. None moved. The power dynamic had shifted so quickly, so cleanly, they hadn't even registered the transformation. A woman they'd laughed at, whispered about, mocked for her masculinity and stoic silence, had just neutralized the most powerful figure on board without a single punch thrown. Ronda released the captain slowly, allowing him to pull his arm back. He scrambled to his feet, furious, humiliated, and red-faced. But he did not lunge again. He stood there, breathing hard, rubbing his wrist. His gaze met hers for only a second before he looked away, Don't, she said quietly. You've done enough. There was no more derision in his stance, only the kind of silence that comes from someone who has just realized he may have been terribly, irreparably wrong. Someone behind Ronda said, "That's Ronda Rousey." The words were quiet, but they fell like a dropped match in a field of dry grass. She's a fighter. No, she's the fighter. Oh my God. Murmurs swelled, not with laughter now, but recognition. A teenage girl further back stood in her seat to see better, phone still raised, her expression a mix of shock and admiration. A businessman in a crisp suit lowered his phone and muttered, "I didn't realize." The boy seated next to Rhonda stared up at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, his eyes wide and reverent. Palmer stood frozen, still blocking the beverage cart. Her face had gone pale. She looked between Rhonda and the captain, searching for an ally and finding none. The elderly woman beside Rhonda cleared her throat. She had not spoken for the duration of the flight, but now she turned to the captain with sharp, unwavering clarity. "You owe her an apology." The captain opened his mouth, closed it again, and stepped back, retreating toward the cockpit. He said nothing. Palmer hesitated, then followed. The aisle remained quiet. The passengers were still stunned, still digesting what had just unfolded in front of them. Some looked ashamed. Others looked impressed. A few, those who had mocked her the loudest, now stared down at their knees. A young man in the adjacent row leaned forward and whispered, "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." Rhonda didn't respond. She sat back down, eyes steady, heartbeat controlled. She didn't gloat, she didn't flex or smirk. The fight had never been about power. It had been about dignity. The boy beside her tugged lightly at her sleeve. "I knew it was you," he said, "from the moment you got on." She turned and looked at him, her expression softening. He smiled. "I'll watch all your fights," he added. "You're amazing." Her lips quirked, the closest she'd come to a smile since the flight began. "Thanks," she said. A new flight attendant arrived moments later. Young, nervous, her eyes darting to Rhonda's face, then away. "Ma'am," she said, barely above a whisper, "the airline representative is on the ground waiting for you when we land. They've been informed." Rhonda nodded once. The young attendant seemed unsure what to do next, then, as if on instinct, whispered, "I'm sorry." "For what?" Rhonda asked, not unkindly. "For everything." The girl left, returning to the galley. The cabin fell into a hush, not of discomfort now, but of awareness. The energy had shifted. Rhonda had not shouted, had not retaliated in anger. She had responded as only someone truly in control could, with discipline, precision, and strength she didn't need to prove. The captain did not emerge from the cockpit again. Palmer remained hidden. The plane continued toward Los Angeles, the hours ticking by in measured quiet. Around her, people returned to their movies, their music, their books, but many glanced her way often. The glances held none of the previous mockery. Now there was respect in them. And shame. No one else said anything cruel. No one asked her to move. No one spilled water in her lap, or questioned her gender, or doubted her presence. She had not demanded space. She had taken it by being who she was. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and finally allowed herself to rest. There was no comfort in the narrow seat of economy class, no silence from the engines or release from the dryness of the air. But she was calm now, not because the storm had passed, but because she had stood still in its center and refused to fall. And she had not done it for applause or validation. She had done it for the millions of times women like her had been told to shrink. She had done it because enough was enough. The hum of the engines had taken on a different tone, not because of any mechanical change, but because the people inside the plane were no longer the same. Where before there had been mockery, superiority, and careless laughter, now there was silence dense with self-consciousness. Passengers who had joined in the ridicule now shifted in their seats, unable to meet each other's eyes, and especially unable to meet hers. The air had grown still. The tension had not dissolved but transformed into discomfort, into guilt, into the fragile kind of respect born not of admiration, but realization. Ronda sat as she had for most of the flight, upright, hands resting lightly on her thighs, eyes calm. There was no arrogance in her expression, no smugness or self-satisfaction. She looked forward, unbothered and unreadable, as though none of it, the slap, the humiliation, the public unraveling of power, had ever happened. But everyone knew it had. They had witnessed it, filmed it, and now they couldn't stop watching her, even if only in fleeting glances. The captain did not return to the cabin. Palmer had disappeared, possibly hiding in the crew area behind the galley. A new attendant, a man in his late 20s with nervous energy, had taken over duties for their section. He moved carefully, his voice soft, his hands tentative as he passed down the aisle, offering water, snacks, and quiet apologies with every glance toward Ronda. No one asked her for a selfie. No one dared. Instead, a strange reverence settled around her seat. People no longer leaned into the aisle. They gave her space, not out of fear, but out of something heavier. Shame, perhaps, or the early seeds of admiration. She had become something more than a celebrity, more than a fighter. In their eyes, she had become a mirror, reflecting back everything they had pretended not to be. A young man across from her, who earlier had joined in the cruel laughter, now sat forward with his elbows on his knees, twisting his wedding ring between his fingers. He looked at her several times as though about to speak, but couldn't bring himself to. When he finally did, his voice cracked slightly. "Ma'am," he began, then faltered. I'm sorry." Ronda turned her head slowly. There was no heat in her gaze, only stillness. The man swallowed hard. "For what I said before, I was out of line." Ronda nodded, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, then looked away. It was enough. He sat back, exhaling through his nose, as if relieved just to have been heard. The moment passed quietly, but it opened something. One by one, passengers began to shift, to lean slightly forward or sideways, to say small things in hushed voices. A woman in her 40s leaned into the aisle and murmured, "You didn't deserve that." A man 2 rows up said, "It's about time someone stood up to them." The boy next to her, emboldened by the shifting mood, finally asked what had been burning in his mind since takeoff. "Can I ask you something?" Ronda looked at him, expression gentle now. "Why didn't you do something earlier?" he asked. "You could have. You had the power." She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. Her answer was not immediate, and when it came, it was measured. "Because how people treat those they think are powerless tells you everything," she said. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but knowing it was true. In the rear galley, whispers passed between the flight attendants who remained. The young man, now serving in Palmer's place, had informed the head of cabin crew about the incident, and word had spread quickly. The internal communication system had already transmitted a formal alert to the ground team. Videos were circulating. By the time the plane landed, the world would know. There would be consequences. Of that, there was no doubt. Palmer, however, had not reappeared. Rumors swirled among the crew that she was crying, that she had locked herself in the storage compartment behind the lavatory, that she had begged the captain to delete the intercom recording. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Not by the passengers, not by the phones, but by her own voice and the choices that came with it. As for the captain, he had locked the cockpit door and ceased all further announcements. The co-pilot, a younger woman, took over communications, her voice cool and professional. She made no mention of the incident, no acknowledgement of what had transpired, but her tone carried a subtle weight, as if even she had been shaken by what had unfolded behind her. An hour before landing, the new attendant approached Ronda's seat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "a representative from corporate security will be meeting you at the gate. They've already been briefed." Ronda nodded. "They've also asked if you'd be willing to speak with the media." She didn't answer. The attendant hesitated. "They said they'd understand if you refused." Still, she said nothing. He left without pressing further. In the rows around her, the mood had settled into a strange serenity. Passengers whispered among themselves, not with mockery now, but with speculation, reflection, even a kind of admiration that had nothing to do with fame. It was the quiet respect people give to someone who has walked through fire and emerged unchanged. A woman 3 rows back had tears in her eyes. No one knew why. Maybe she had seen herself in Ronda. Maybe she had seen someone she loved, someone who had once been laughed at for being too strong, too different, too much. Or maybe it was just the weight of collective guilt pressing down on her chest. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came through the speakers, strained and brief. "This is your captain," he said. "We'll be landing in Los Angeles in approximately 20 minutes. I want to thank you for flying with us." There was no signature confidence in his voice, no rehearsed charm, only exhaustion. Ronda remained still. She had not spoken again since answering the boy. She had nothing more to say, not here. Her silence had done enough. The landing was smooth. As the wheels touched down and the brakes slowed the aircraft, a few people clapped out of habit, but the applause quickly died. No one knew what to say, or if saying anything at all was appropriate anymore. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the first-class curtain opened. Men in Navy suits boarded before the seatbelt sign had even turned off. They moved with quiet authority, discreet earpieces coiled around their necks. One of them glanced down the aisle, spotted Ronda, and nodded to another. Then came the shift. Passengers began rising from their seats, retrieving bags, shuffling in place. But as Ronda stood, people moved aside for her. The crowd parted, not from fear, but from deference. She stepped into the aisle without a single elbow brushing her. The elderly woman who had sat beside her reached for her hand as she passed and gave it a light squeeze. "Thank you," she said simply. Ronda paused, nodded, and continued forward. As she neared the front of the cabin, the captain remained hidden behind the locked door. Palmer was nowhere in sight. Only the young attendant stood near the exit, offering a small, sincere smile. "Thank you, Miss Rousey," he said. She nodded again, then stepped through the door into the jet bridge. Waiting for her was a small gathering of people, suits and security, media with badges, flashes of phone cameras already beginning. The real storm had just begun. But as she walked into it, head high, shoulders squared, there was no trace of hesitation. She had not asked for this moment, but it had come. And now she owned it. Ronda stepped into the tunnel of the jet bridge with the same gait she had carried onto countless walkouts before a fight. Shoulders steady, arms relaxed at her sides, chin slightly lifted. But this wasn't a stadium filled with roaring fans or an octagon waiting beneath a spotlight. This was a quiet corridor of metal and carpeted walls, stale air and hushed footsteps, where her presence suddenly meant more than belts, titles, or fame. It meant proof. It meant exposure, not of her, but of everything that had just happened on that plane. The corporate security agents stood in a respectful arc near the end of the tunnel, a collection of solemn suits with earpieces and quiet professionalism. One of them, a woman in her 40s with a sleek black tablet under her arm, stepped forward with a practiced half-smile. "Miss Rousey, we're deeply sorry for what you experienced today. If it's all right, we'd like to escort you to a private lounge. There's a representative from Horizon Air's executive office waiting to speak with you. Legal counsel is available if you'd like it. You're under no obligation to speak with the press." Ronda gave a single nod. She didn't say anything. The woman gestured for her to follow, and Ronda moved without a word, her steps soundless on the synthetic carpet. Behind her, the remaining passengers began filing out of the jet bridge, their chatter subdued. Some glanced her way as they passed. A few stopped short, visibly startled by the crowd waiting for her. One man, one of the loudest from earlier, quickly looked down and walked faster. Inside the executive lounge, the air was crisp with the scent of filtered coffee and institutional cologne. The windows looked out over the tarmac, where luggage carts zipped between planes and airport staff moved with the rehearsed efficiency of routine. A table had been set with bottles of water and sealed boxes of catered food. No one offered her any. No one pretended to. The representative from Horizon Air was already standing, his tie loosened, his smile strained. He extended a hand. "Miss Rousey, I'm Evan Whitmore. I want to start by saying how ashamed I am of what happened aboard Flight 274. This is not who we are as a company." Ronda looked at the hand, then shook it briefly. She sat down without waiting to be invited. Whitmore cleared his throat, clearly unsettled by the absence of any performative response. "I've already spoken to our crisis response team," he continued. "We're launching a full internal investigation. Captain Reeve has been suspended pending inquiry. The flight attendant, Palmer, has also been removed from active duty. There's absolutely no excuse for the way you were treated." Ronda said nothing. Whitmore faltered. "We would also like to extend a formal apology, both privately and publicly. A statement is being drafted for media outlets. We want to ensure the public understands that this incident does not reflect our values." One of the legal advisors stepped forward, a short man in a pinstripe suit with a neat leather folder. "Miss Rousey, we also want to offer compensation for the ordeal. A settlement, if you're open to it. We'll be happy to discuss figures privately at your convenience." Still, she did not respond. Whitmore leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Of course, you may prefer to pursue other actions, lawsuits if necessary. We fully understand. We just hope, sincerely, that we can begin to make this right." Finally, Ronda looked up. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but unwavering. "I'm not here for compensation," she said. "I'm not here to make a statement or hold a press conference. I didn't get on that plane to be seen. I got on it because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be just another person. Not someone with security, not someone at the front, just a woman going home." There was a pause. "And I wasn't seen at all," she added, "until I stood up." Whitmore nodded slowly, clearly unsure how to proceed. "I don't want your settlement," she continued. "I want training, mandatory training, not the kind with slides and checkboxes. I want every flight crew member in your company to sit through a course led by someone who's been on the other end of what happened today. I want your captains to be taught the difference between authority and abuse. And I want every single one of them to understand how easy it is to become the reason someone stops believing in fairness." The legal advisor blinked, adjusting his glasses. Whitmore's posture straightened. "We can make that happen," he said. "You'll need to," she replied. Outside the lounge, the murmur of voices had grown louder. News had spread faster than any official statement. Social media was flooded with clips of the incident. Hashtags trended within hours. #Ronda Rousey Flight 274. #Believe Women. #Strong is not threatening. Commentary filled the feeds, some praising her restraint, others shocked by the airline's conduct, a few still clinging to disbelief that a woman like her could exist outside of a ring or screen and be dismissed as less than human. Ronda didn't read any of it. Instead, she changed clothes in the private bathroom of the lounge. She traded her hoodie and track pants for jeans and a soft navy blue t-shirt. She tied her hair back again, this time not to hide, but because she liked it that way. When she emerged, Whitmore stood waiting with an envelope in hand. "We'd like to provide transportation to wherever you need," he said. "I'll walk," she answered. He looked surprised but nodded. When she stepped out into the terminal, the first thing she noticed wasn't the cameras. It was the girl. A teenager, maybe 16, with tangled hair and a cast on her left arm, stood off to the side near a row of vending machines, holding a handmade sign in trembling hands. It read, simply, "You helped me breathe again." Their eyes met. Ronda walked toward her slowly. The girl didn't speak at first, her eyes filled with tears. "I saw the video," she whispered. I didn't know women like you could exist in real life." Ronda gave her a gentle smile. "We do." The girl looked down, ashamed of her tears. "I just wanted to say thank you." "You just did," Ronda said. Behind them, reporters gathered, some trying to shout questions, others waiting with lenses raised, but none of them stepped too close. Not after what they had seen. Not after what they had learned. One reporter finally called out, "Miss Rousey, what would you say to young women who watch this happen?" Ronda turned, just enough for her voice to carry. "I'd say strength isn't how hard you hit. It's how long you can stand when the world tries to make you sit down." Then she turned again and kept walking, past the baggage claim, past the escalators, past the airport entirely. She didn't wait for a car. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Later that evening, headlines filled the internet. News anchors recounted the details, played the videos on loop, speculated about the fallout. Editorials praised her, criticized the airline, examined the intersection of power and prejudice. Hashtags multiplied. Think pieces emerged by the dozens. But Ronda Rousey, sitting quietly on the deck of her modest Los Angeles home, her dog curled up beside her, didn't read a single one. She watched the sun set, the sky painted in layers of orange and lavender, and for the first time in days allowed herself to breathe. She had fought many battles in her life, some in cages, some in stadiums, some against doubt and pain, and the expectations of a world uncomfortable with women who refused to shrink. But today had been different. She hadn't won a title. She had reclaimed something far greater, and that, she knew, was the kind of victory that didn't need a belt. It needed only a woman who refused to sit down. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to see what happens when silence is no longer an option, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.